community went to the aid of the government and people of Iraq. I'm happy to give away my second name time.
On the first select, forgiving way, he talks about the desperation in Iraq. I've just had an email from someone who I'll keep anonymous because they're working in Raqqa. And they say this: Daesh are the death that is stretching from the east. When you see them, it is as if you are seeing the angel of death. They're in Raqqa right now. How can I carry on exposing my child to severed heads and hanging bodies on a daily basis? A mother in Raqqa.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend, and the reality we have to acknowledge is that whether we like it or not, ISIL is at war with us. We don't have to confect some case about weapons of mass destruction, nor is this about a threat to the citizens of a country from their own government. This is about people at war with us and our values and our society. This is not a war of choice. And I haven't spoken to anyone, Mr. Speaker, who demurs from the proposition that ISIL must be denied the territory that they currently control. And whilst the defeat of ISIL and its ideology will be the work of many years, even decades, the retaking of this territory is an urgent and immediate requirement. This, therefore, is the mission. Whilst the civil war rages in Syria, it is virtually impossible to achieve that. That is the necessary first step. And finally, after the negotiations and the agreement of the Syrian International Support Group at Vienna on the 14th of November, a way can be seen to that transition. Before then, I don't believe the government was able to offer an answer to our question of which ground forces will take hold and administer the territories captured from ISIL in Syria to the satisfaction of the committee. In the wake of that, I believe they can and did. And indeed, the Prime Minister made the point today rather revealingly when he mentioned the real plan. And it's the real plan is the ideal solution, which is referenced on page 20 of the Prime Minister's response to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, when he envisages the political transition in Syria, allowing a new leadership and reform of the Syrian Arab Army to enable it to tackle terrorist groups in defence of the Syrian nation. The Syrian army, fighting alongside the Free Syrian Army, ideally need to be the forces that reclaim Syria for a new Syrian republic. But we should not imagine for 1 minute that this is a task they will be able to accomplish on their own. We need to influence the policy of our coalition partners and the policy of the whole international community to face up to the reality that this entails. This is the crucial issue. How would we, the United Kingdom, exercise the greatest influence? Everything I have heard in the last month taking evidence on this issue suggests that our role as a compromised and limited member of the coalition against ISIL, operating only in Iraq, weakens that influence. Now we can debate the efficacy of airstrikes and the additional capability that brimstone missiles bring to the whole coalition. But the truth is, we all know that those issues are marginal to the outcome. What is not marginal to the outcome is getting the international politics right. And it is not in the interest of our country or the people we represent for this House to deny the government the authority it needs today. I am now satisfied that the government, who along with the Americans helped block the transition process by our preconditions about the role of Bashar al-Assad, can now play a critically constructive role in the transition. Indeed, my criticism of today's motion is that the government should be seeking wider authority from the House. Limiting the targeting of ISIL and excluding al-Nusra and any future terrorist groups that will be listed by the United Nations as envisaged under the UN Security Council Resolution 2249 is a restriction I do not understand. If armed groups put themselves beyond recall in the judgment of both the International Syrian Support Group and the Security Council, then our armed forces should be authorised to act within the law. Equally, the limitation on deploying UK troops in ground combat operations, I believe, shows a lack of foresight. We know that both Syrian and Iraqi armed forces are going to need the maximum possible help, which arguably should include the embedding of trainers in the fighting echelon capability that includes artillery and engineers, as well as comprehensive logistical, service support, command and control and communication functions. Where will these come from? And the truth is that since this mission must succeed, if necessary, these war-winning capabilities may need to be found from beyond the neighbouring Sunni countries and the whole of the United Nations, with effective military capability may be required to provide that, including us. However, if the government has chosen a path, I'm afraid I can't give way to my honourable colleague and friend on the committee, who's made such an excellent impression on the committee so far, because I'm time limited. If there is time at the end, I will let his. If there is time at the end, I will take his intervention. However, if the government has chosen a path that is going to require it to come back to this House for more authority, then that's the government's choice. To my mind, ISIL is such a clear and present danger to the civilised world that if all necessary means are endorsed by the Security Council, then so should this House. The Foreign Affairs Committee will continue our inquiry into the international strategy to defeat ISIL, and on behalf of this House, to hold the government to account in detail. The Right Honourable Lady for Cullen Valley who is sadly unwell, but hopefully in recovery, and we wish her a speedy recovery, has communicated to me that she would be supporting the government this evening. The honourable member for Ilford South's view does not take much guessing as to which side he would be on this evening. And in my judgment, this House will best discharge its responsibilities by giving our government the authority it needs, not just to act with our international partners against this horror, but to influence them to make the necessary compromises in their national objectives and to ensure the collective security of all nations. And I give way to my honourable friend from North East.
I'd like to thank the member for Reigate, and if I can take the opportunity to pay tribute to his work as chairman of this committee. We will be on opposite sides tonight, but I pay tribute to that. Earlier on, the member mentioned the point about where we would sit, and I would like to make the point that during our evidence, it says in our report, several of our witnesses suggested that by participating in military action against ISIL in Syria, the UK would actually compromise its diplomatic capability.
That's a point that's going to have to come to our own conclusions. I have to say to him and to the House that nothing I've heard in the last month has pointed towards anything except the opposite of that conclusion. And ministers have been clear about that evidence. Every single country we went to who was asked this question said that the United Kingdom's position was compromised by the fact that we were only half in and half out of the coalition. It's a position of no conceivable diplomatic benefit, and it's one that this House should rectify this evening. Mr. Speaker, part of the Prime Minister's challenge is that we were both present 12 years ago when another Prime Minister delivered an utterly compelling performance, and we made the United Kingdom party to a disaster in the Middle East. It's right that we should be mindful of our recent history, but we must not be hamstrung by it.
This is Margaret Beckett.
This debate centres on national security and on the safety of our constituents, and there'll be differences of view within and between every party in this House. So, in good faith and conscience, members will reach different conclusions. Anybody who approaches today's debate without the gravest doubts, reservations and anxieties simply hasn't been paying attention. But we're sent here by our constituents to exercise our best judgment, each our own best judgment. This is a debate of contradictions. The terms of today's motion, echoing the UN resolution, are stern, almost apocalyptic, in the threat they describe as an unprecedented threat to international peace and security. But the proposal before us amounts, as my honourable friend Forgotten said, only to a relatively minor extension of action we are already undertaking. We're being asked to agree to act both in Iraq and Syria precisely because that is what Daesh do, and their headquarters is in Syria. We're being asked to make a further contribution to an existing international effort to contain Daesh from extending the mayhem and bloodshed that accompanies their every move even more widely across the Middle East. Serious questions are being raised, and I respect those who raise them. There is unease about ground forces. There is proper concern about the strategy and the endgame, and about the aftermath, about rebuilding. Some say simply that innocent people are more likely to be killed. Military action does create casualties, however much we try to minimize them. So should we, on those grounds, abandon action in Iraq, although we undertake it at the request of Iraq's government, and it does seem to be making a difference? Should we take no further action against Daesh, who are themselves killing innocent people and striving to kill more every day of the week? Or should we simply leave it to others? Would we make ourselves a bigger target for Daesh attack? We are a target. We will remain a target. There's no need to wonder about it. Daesh has told us so and continues to tell us so with every day that passes. We may as well take them not just at their word, but indeed at their deeds. They have sought out our fellow countrymen and women to kill, including aid workers and other innocents, and whatever we decide today, there is no doubt that they will do so again. Nor is the consequence of inaction simply Daesh controlling more territory, more land. We've seen what happens where they take control. The treatment of groups such as the Yazidis in all its horror should surely make us unwilling to contemplate any further extension of Daesh-controlled territory. Inaction, too, leads that way to death and destruction. Quite separately, there are those not opposed in principle to action who doubt the efficacy of what is proposed. A coalition action which rests almost wholly on bombing, they say, will have little effect. Well, tell that to the Kosovans. And don't forget that if there had been no bombing in Kosovo, perhaps 1 million Albanian Muslim refugees would have been seeking refuge in Europe. Tell that to the Kurds in Kobani, who, if memory serves, pleaded for international air support without which they felt they were losing control to Daesh. Tell them in Sierra Leone that military action should always be avoided because there would be casualties. Their state and their peace were almost destroyed. It was British military action that brought them back from the brink. Of course, it took place in conjunction with political and diplomatic activity, and I share the view that it's vital that such activity is substantially strengthened, and I was heartened by what the Prime Minister told us today. Our conference did call for a United Nations resolution before further action, and we now have a unanimous Security Council resolution. Moreover, that resolution calls on member states in explicit and unmistakable terms to combat Daesh's threat, and I quote, by all means. And it calls to, and again I quote, for us to eradicate the safe haven they have established in Iraq and Syria. Those are the words of the UN resolution. And though it speaks of the need to pursue the peace process, the United Nations resolution calls on member states to act now. Moreover, our French allies have explicitly asked us for such support, and I invite the House to consider how we would feel and what we would say if what took place in Paris had happened in London, if we had explicitly asked France for support and France had refused. These are genuinely, extremely, I'm sorry, no. These are genuinely extremely difficult, as well as extremely serious decisions. But it is the urgings of the United Nations and of the socialist government in France that, for me, have been the tipping point in my decision to support military action.
John Barron.
Mr. Speaker, I refer the House to the amendment in my name and that of other honourable members. There are many on both sides of the House who feel that extending airstrikes into Syria is not a wise move in the absence of a long-term strategy, realistic strategy, both military and non-military. Otherwise, we risk repeating the errors that we made in Iraq, in Helmand, in Libya, and would have made only 2 years ago in this House if we had allowed the government to intervene on behalf of the rebels. That strategy must include comprehensive layout as to the military plans. It must include thought given and plans made for the aftermath, and indeed an exit strategy. But many of these questions that we have asked remain unanswered. But can I just say that we all accept there are no easy answers in foreign policy nowadays, just a series of tough decisions. But as such, there has got to be respect on both sides to those views held. One or two people have suggested that one is playing politics or personalities with this issue. I would refer them to my voting record on Iraq, my opposition to the extension of the Afghan mission to Helmand, my opposition to Libya, and indeed 2 years ago in this House when we were asked to support arming the rebels and then extending or striking Assad. I have been called a pacifist and worse, and I would refer those people to my military record as a soldier, where I've got the medals to prove I'm certainly not a pacifist, and also to my record in Northern Ireland as a platoon commander during the 1980s. By all means.
I have huge respect for my honourable friend. As a military man, will he agree with me that in all military operations throughout history, the first thing that goes wrong on day one is the plan? However, that should not stop us from making the effort and hopefully succeeding at the end, where we hope a peaceful solution can be finally found.
I wouldn't disagree with my honourable friend at all, but at the same time, we owe it to those participating in any military action that we think very carefully through the plans to make sure they are as realistic, as comprehensive as possible. Otherwise, I suggest we do risk repeating past errors. Yes.
I'd like to thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I have huge respect for him and his military record. Now, while he makes some eloquent points about the complexity of the situation and the seeking of a political solution in the end, surely the protection of our people and the safety in our streets has to come first.
I completely agree with my honourable friend. There are many on both sides of this House who oppose the government on extending military airstrikes, who believe that to be the case. But don't forget, some of us supported the initial deployment to Afghanistan in 2001 on that basis because there was a clearly laid out strategy. What I don't see in this plan is a clearly laid out strategy, and that is why we have got to ask these questions and try and get some answers. But perhaps the most damning, Mr. Speaker, most damning accusation against those of us who say we don't want to support the extension of military airstrikes is that we're sort of sitting on our hands. We don't want to do anything. We want to stick our heads in the sand. And I would refer to that point that we do believe, or many of us believe anyway, in the need for military action to take on terrorists. Many of us supported that initial deployment to Afghanistan in 2001, and we succeeded very quickly within a couple of years. Where we had trouble with Afghanistan is when the mission morphed into one of nation building, when we simply did not realise what we were getting into and did not have the resources to back it up. But we need a long-term strategy. So what should that be? What should it include? It's no good just standing here and saying we need one if we haven't got an idea what it should be. Well, let me give some examples. Let's talk about the non-military side of this. We've been talking about disrupting Daesh's financial flows and business interests in this place for at least a year, if not 18 months. There has been no noticeable disruption of those business interests or financial flows. We have command of the skies in Syria. Why are we not disrupting those business and financial interests? There's no been real answer about that. Why aren't we doing more to disrupt their prominence on social media? Again, we've talked about it in this place many times, but I do not see any evidence of us actually disrupting that prominence. Something we should tackle, but perhaps above all, Mr. Speaker, we should be tackling the ideology and the sectarianism that feeds the extremism that these groups, including Daesh, feed off. Now, that is a long-term strategy. You can't do it overnight. But again, I don't see much evidence of that. Where are those awkward questions to our allies in the region about feeding this extremism? We're not getting that message across. But can I come back to the point that has been raised before, but courtesy of the Foreign Affairs Committee recent visit to the Middle East, we only managed to get back Thursday morning in time for the Prime Minister's statement, about these mythical 70,000 troops. We all know, we all accept, you cannot bomb ISIL out of existence through airstrikes alone. It will take ground forces. But everybody is having trouble identifying what those ground forces should be and who should actually supply them. We visited various capitals. We visited Tehran, we visited Riyadh, we visited Abu Dhabi, spoke to a lot of experts across a wide range of fields. And the point that kept coming across was the belief that there are very few moderates remaining in Syria after 5 years of civil war. But even if you believe the 70,000 figure, even if you believe they were all moderates, what the strategy doesn't address, and I haven't had an answer back, and I have asked this question before, is what is stopping these moderates, once the common enemy, once they've been somehow miraculously told to swing round, stop fighting Assad and take on Daesh, what is stopping them splintering into 100 or even 1,000 militias, as we saw in Libya? We ignore the lessons of Libya, Mr. Speaker, at our cost, because what we were being told on the ground only last week is that they are a very splintered, very not a homogenous group by any stretch of the imagination, and they are liable to turn on each other just as they are to turn on an enemy if they are so set to do so. And we should. I've made this point. I'm sorry. I've allowed 2 interventions. I must now crack on. And we should also draw the lessons with Iraq. I mean, we are struggling to defeat Daesh in Iraq, and that is with estimates vary, but certainly 800, 900,000 security forces on our payroll. I mean, one strategy you could employ is actually finish the job in Iraq before we actually start thinking about any long-term strategy in Syria. But again, we're struggling. And that is one of the fundamental differences between Iraq and Syria. As for the issue about sitting at the top table, can I just address this point very centrally? Because again, this was a strong message when we were visiting the Middle East. We are already at the top table. China is not intending to intervene in this situation, and yet sits at the top table in Vienna as a member of the P5. We would do so also, and it's quite clear that we are showing solidarity with our partners. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, the short-term effect of British airstrikes will be marginal. I think most people accept that. But as we intervene more, we become more responsible for the events on the ground and lay ourselves open to the unintended consequences of the fog of war. Without a comprehensive strategy, Airstrikes will simply reinforce the West's long-term failure in the region generally, at a time when there are already too many aircraft chasing too few targets. And I suggest, just as in previous ill-advised Western interventions, a strong pattern emerges. Time and time again, the executive makes a convincing case, often with supporting intelligence sources, and time again, it turns out to be wrong. Just a few weeks ago, the Foreign Affairs Committee produced a very reasoned and thoughtful report arguing against airstrikes in Syria in the absence of a comprehensive long-term strategy. Returning from my travels, I and other colleagues still hold to that view, and it was the decision of the committee last night that the Prime Minister had not adequately answered or addressed our concerns. So, Mr. Speaker, I will oppose this military action and will intend to move the amendment in my name and that of other honourable members. We have stood at this very point before. We should have no excuse for repeating our errors and setting out on the same tragic, misguided path once more.
Johnson.
Member for Basildon and Billericay. It is during my time in Parliament that it's become a convention that this House authorises military action, whereas previously it was for a Prime Minister to do under the guise of royal prerogative. Sometimes they would involve the House of Commons, most often they didn't. And this new convention, I believe, places a responsibility on members of Parliament to weigh up the arguments and vote according to their conscience rather than a parliamentary whip. I'm not sure if other parties are whipped on this vote or not, but what I'm pretty sure about is that nobody on any side of this House would seek to justify their vote tonight by pleading that whilst they disagreed or agreed with the proposition, the whip forced them to vote the way they did. On votes such as this, with the exception of the front bench, perhaps the whip is irrelevant. So whilst I'm grateful to the Shadow Cabinet for the free vote my party has been afforded, I don't think it will make the slightest difference to the way we make our decision. I intend to vote for the motion this evening for one basic reason. I believe that ISIL-Daesh poses a real and present danger to British citizens, and that its dedicated external operations unit is based not in Iraq, where the RAF is already fully engaged, but in Syria. This external operations unit is already responsible for killing 30 British holidaymakers on a beach in Sousse, and a British rock fan who perished along with 129 others in the Paris atrocity a few weeks ago. It's true that this unit could have moved out of Raqqa, but that's not what the intelligence services believe. In fact, the fact is that just as Al-Qaeda needed the safe haven they created for themselves in Afghanistan to plan 9/11 and other atrocities, so ISIL-Daesh need their self-declared caliphate to finance, train, organise and recruit to their wicked cause. Yes, there may be cells elsewhere, but there is little doubt that the nerve centre is in Raqqa. Just over 14 months ago, this House sanctioned military action in Iraq against ISIL-Daesh by 524 votes to 43. Nobody expected that action to bring about a swift end to the threat from ISIL. Indeed, the Prime Minister, in responding to an intervention, said, and I quote, "This mission will take not just months, but years." Many honourable and right honourable members felt at that time that it was illogical to have the effectiveness of our action diminished by a border that ISIL-Daesh didn't recognise. We were inhibited by the absence of a specific UN resolution. And so there was some justification for this House to confine its response to one part of ISIL-held territory in September 2014. There can surely be no such justification in December 2015. No such justification after Paris. No such justification given the request for help from our nearest continental neighbour and close ally in response to the murderous attack that took place on 13th of November. No such justification, I'll give way in a second, no such justification after UN Security Council Resolution 2249. Paragraph 5 of that resolution unanimously agreed, and I quote, calls upon member states that have the capacity to do so to take all necessary measures to eradicate the safe haven ISIL has established over significant parts of Iraq and Syria. I give way.
I thank the honourable member for taking my question. And can I put the point which I would have put to the honourable member for South Derby? A similar call from France was met by Germany, with Germany sending reconnaissance aircraft but refusing to bomb.
Mr. Speaker, Germany are constrained by their history, but the point I'm making is that after recent events, where we sit now in this Parliament, having authorised military action by the RAF in Iraq, we can no longer justify not responding to that by extending our operations into Syria. If we ignore that part of UN Resolution 2249 that I've just mentioned, we're left supporting only the pieties contained in the other paragraphs, unequivocally condemning, expressing deepest sympathy, reaffirming that those responsible must be held to account. In other words, Britain, this country, will be expressing indignation whilst doing nothing to implement the action unanimously agreed in a motion which, in our role as chair of the Security Council, we had helped to formulate. Furthermore, there is no argument against our involvement in attacking ISIL-Daesh in Syria that cannot be made against our action in Iraq, where we've helped to prevent ISIL's expansion and reclaimed 30% of the territory it occupied. As the Prime Minister set out in his response to the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, I'll give one in a second. Prime Minister pointed out in his response, this means that RAF tornadoes with these special pods so sophisticated that they gather 60% of the coalition's tactical reconnaissance in Iraq can be used to similar effect in Syria, so long as another country then comes in to complete the strike. This is a ridiculous situation for this country to be in. I give way.
I thank my friend again. Is the difference, though, in Iraq to Syria, that on the ground in Iraq is a long-established ally of ours in the Kurds, in the Peshmerga, who actually want to work with us? We haven't got that in Syria. We've got what the Prime Minister is now describing as a patchwork.
I think my honourable friend, as always, makes a really important point. I've just reread the Hansard from that debate we had back in September 2014. This wasn't raised by anyone, incidentally. The issues of what comes next, and it's a very important consideration, and we've expressed concerns on all sides of the House. It mustn't stop us responding to what happened in Paris, responding to Resolution 2249, and the request for all countries with the capability to act now. The UN resolution didn't say, let's delay this, it said to act now. And I don't believe there's anybody in this House that believes that defeating this motion tonight will somehow remove us from the line of fire, that ISIL-Daesh and its allies will consider us to no longer be a legitimate target for their barbaric activities. The 102 people murdered in Ankara were at a peace rally. The 7 plots foiled by the security services so far this year were all planned against us before this motion was even conceived. Our decision today will not alter ISIL-Daesh's contempt for this country and our way of life one iota. But it could, I believe, affect their ability to plan and execute their attacks. If it doesn't destroy this capability in Syria, it will force their external operations unit to move, and in so doing make it more exposed and less effective. The motion presents a package of measures which will be taken forward by the international community to bring about the transformation in Syria that we all want to see, and we're promised regular updates as part of this motion on that aspect. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, I believe it meets the standards that many members will have set for endorsing military action now that the convention applies. Is it a just cause? Is the proposed action a last resort? Is it proportionate? Does it have a reasonable prospect of success? Does it have broad regional support? Does it have a clear legal base? I think it meets all of those criteria. I find this decision as difficult as anyone to make. I wish I had, frankly, the self-righteous certitude of the finger-jabbing representatives of our new and kinder type of politics who will no doubt soon be contacting those of us who support this motion tonight. But I believe that ISIL-Daesh has to be confronted and destroyed if we are to properly defend our country and our way of life. And I believe that this motion provides the best way to achieve this objective.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Mr. Speaker, honourable members are being asked to back airstrikes against Daesh to show solidarity with our French and American friends. Yet a gesture of solidarity, however sincerely meant, cannot be a substitute for hard-headed strategy. Most Defence Committee members probably intend to vote for such airstrikes, but I shall vote against airstrikes in the absence of credible ground forces as ineffective and potentially dangerous, just as I voted against the proposal to bomb Assad in 2013. Indeed, the fact that the British government wanted to bomb first one side and then the other in the same civil war in such a short space of time illustrates, to my mind, a vacuum at the heart of our strategy. At least we are now targeting our deadly Islamist enemies rather than trying to bring down yet another dictator with the same likely results as in Iraq and in Libya. Daesh must indeed be driven out of its territory militarily, but this can be done only by a credible force which is ready and able to do the fighting on the ground. So who will supply this force, without which airstrikes cannot prevail? The failure of the ineptly named Arab Spring in so many countries shows the two most likely outcomes: a victory for authoritarian dictatorship on the one hand, or a victory for revolutionary Islamism on the other. Moderation and democracy have barely featured in the countries affected, and Syria seems to be no exception. I am sorry to say, genuinely sorry to say, that we face a choice between very nasty authoritarians and Islamist totalitarians. There is no third way. Our government, however, is in denial about this. It does concede that airstrikes must be in support of ground forces, and has come up with a remarkable figure from the Joint Intelligence Committee of 70,000 so-called moderate fighters with whom we can supposedly coordinate our airstrikes. It is very doubtful, however, that were such an alliance successful, the territory freed from Daesh would cease to be under Islamist control. Yes, I think I heard the Honourable Lady first.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. Could he comment specifically upon the independent reports that indicate the Free Syrian Army are currently selling supplied weapons to Daesh in their own fight against Assad?
It is certainly true that there have been well-documented cases of such weapons ending up in the hands of Daesh, though I wouldn't wish to tar the entire Free Syrian Army with what some of its factions might have done, or in fact have done, as the Honourable Lady rightly suggests. But in an attempt, in a moment, in an attempt to try and establish the facts about these 70,000, I have made inquiries of two people whose expert opinion I much admire. One is the writer and journalist Patrick Cockburn, who is one of Britain's leading commentators on Syria and Iraq, and who was one of the first to write about the threat from what was then called ISIS long before it captured Mosul. This is what he tells me, and I quote, "Unfortunately, the belief that there are 70,000 moderate opposition fighters on the ground in Syria is wishful thinking. The armed opposition is dominated by ISIS or Al-Qaeda type organizations. There are many small and highly fragmented groups of opposition fighters who do not like Assad or ISIS and could be described as non-extremist, but they are generally men from a single clan, tribe, or village. They are often guns for hire, and they operate under license from the Al-Qaeda affiliate, the Al-Nusra Front, or its near equivalent, Ahrar al-Sham. Many of these groups, no, I'm sorry, I've promised over there. Many of these groups seek to present a moderate face abroad, but remain violently sectarian and intolerant inside Syria." I promise the Honourable Gentleman.
The Honourable Gentleman for giving way. But does he not agree with me that it's a ridiculous situation? On the one hand, the government praises the Kurds. On the other hand, the government's ally Turkey is attacking the Kurds. How ridiculous can you get than that?
I thank him for that contribution. It's not only ridiculous, it's highly dangerous. And I will insert at this point something I was going to leave out. I would just say in passing, to have separate conflicts going on within the same battle space without reaching a proper agreement can lead us into all sorts of nasty confrontations, the worst of which would be if we ended up eyeball to eyeball with the Russians when they and we share the same common enemy in ISIL-Daesh. The second expert I consulted was our former ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford. And this is how he describes the Free Syrian Army. He calls it a rag bag of 58 factions at the last count, united mainly by a desire to use the FSA appellation in order to secure Gulf, Turkish and Western funding. He goes on to say that most of the factions, which are extremely locally based, have no interest whatsoever in being drawn into battles against groups which basically share their sectarian agenda hundreds of miles away in areas with which they're unfamiliar. So, Mr. Speaker, instead of having dodgy dossiers, we now have bogus battalions of moderate fighters. Now, I wish to continue as follows. Once Daesh has been driven out, if eventually we get an overall military strategy together, which adding a few bombing raids does not comprise, once it has been driven out, as it must be driven out, there arises the question of the occupying power. Because there will have to be an occupying power remaining in control for many years to come if other Islamists are not going to take over from Daesh. That occupying force must be a Muslim one, and only the Syrian government army is likely to provide it. Indeed, as the Prime Minister himself acknowledged in the Commons on 26th of November, and I quote, "In time, the best ground troops should be the Syrian army." So, to bring matters to a close, airstrikes alone are a dangerous diversion and distraction. What is needed is a grand military alliance involving not only the West, but Russia and, yes, its Syrian government clients too. I honestly think that my honourable friend, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, has had more than his fair share in this debate, and I'm going to make use of mine. We need we need to choose the lesser of two evils and abandon the fiction of a cosy third choice. There is a general consensus now that the decision to remove Saddam Hussein was a terrible mistake. But Saddam Hussein was every bit as much of a vicious dictator as we are told that Assad is. So ask yourself, when you're thinking about the hard choice that has to be faced tonight, ask yourself this. You may feel pious about it, looking back on the wrong decision that was made about Saddam Hussein, but a very similar decision confronts us tonight. It is a question of choosing the lesser of two evils, not fooling ourselves that there's a cosy third option, which in reality is a fantasy.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know that no Parliament ever takes a more serious decision than what we should do to protect the security and safety of our nation and whether to put our forces in harm's way. And I know that every member of the House will be weighing that decision very seriously, not least because the truth is we have got those decisions wrong before, and our governments have got those decisions wrong before. When we went into Iraq in 2003, but also when we failed to intervene early enough in Bosnia a decade before that. And so, since the Prime Minister made his case last Thursday, I've raised a series of questions, sought for a series of assurances, some of which I have received and some of which I have not. And I do not believe that the Prime Minister has made the most effective case, and so I understand why many in this House feel that they are not yet convinced. But I also feel that I cannot say that the coalition airstrikes that are underway already in both Syria and Iraq should somehow stop. And if they're not to stop, and France has asked for our help, I do not think that we can say no. So I think that there are changes that need to be made to the government's approach, and I will argue for them. And I think there are more limits in the approach they need to take, but I will also vote with the government on this motion tonight, even though I recognise how difficult that is for so many of us. The whole House, I think, agrees that we need a strategy that delivers peace and defeats ISIS, Daesh. But I disagree with any suggestion that somehow this can be done as ISIS first or Daesh first in their approach, because I think that simply will not work. In the end, we know that it is the Vienna process, that it is the process to replace the Assad regime, which is dropping barrel bombs on so many innocent people across Syria, which is crucial to also preventing the recruitment for ISIS as well. And if we or the coalition are seen to be siding with Assad or to be somehow strengthening Assad, that will increase recruitment for Daesh as well. I also disagree with the suggestion that somehow there are 70,000 troops who are going to step in, and the purpose of these airstrikes is to provide air cover for those troops to be able to take on and defeat Daesh, because we know that's not going to happen anytime soon. We know that there aren't such forces anywhere near Raqqa. We know too that those forces are divided. The airstrikes won't be part of an imminent, decisive military campaign. But I also disagree with those who say that instead of ISIS first, somehow we should have Vienna first, and we should wait until the peace process is completed in order to take airstrike action against Daesh. And that's why I think the coalition airstrikes are still needed. We know that ISIS is not going to be part of the peace process. They won't negotiate. They are a death cult that glorifies suicide and slaughter. And we know too that they have continuous ambitions to expand and continuous ambitions to attack us, to attack our allies, to have terror threats not just in Paris, not just in Tunisia, but all over the world and anywhere that they get the chance. They hold oil, territory, communications that they want to use to expand. And I don't think that the coalition can simply stand back and give them free rein while we work on that vital peace process. When coalition airstrikes are already in place involving France, involving Turkey, involving Jordan, the US, Morocco, Bahrain, Australia, if we have evidence that there are communication networks that are being used in order to plan attacks in Paris or Berlin or Brussels or London? Can we really say that those coalition airstrikes should not take place to take those communication networks out? If we have evidence that there are supply routes being used to plan an expansion to take over more territory, to increase their barbaric regime into wider spaces, do we really think that the coalition airstrikes should not be able to take those supply routes out? And if we think that the coalition airstrikes should continue, can we really say no when France, having gone through the terrible ordeal of Paris, says they want our help in continuing those airstrikes now? And I have argued in this place and elsewhere continually for our country to do far more, to share in the international support for refugees who are fleeing the conflict. And I still think we should do much more and not leave it to other countries alone. But that same argument about sanctuary applies to security as well. And I don't think we can leave it to other countries to take the strain. And I cannot ignore the advice from security experts that without coalition airstrikes over the next 12 months, the threat from Daesh in the region, but also in Europe and in Britain, will be much greater. And I think we have to do our bit to try to contain that threat, not to promise we can defeat or overthrow it in the short term, because we cannot, but at least to contain what they do. And I also think it's important to make sure we degrade their capacity to obliterate the remaining moderate and opposition forces, however big they are, because when Vienna does get properly moving, there has to be some opposition forces. It cannot simply be a peace debate with involving Assad and Daesh as the only forces left standing, because that will never bring peace and security to the region. So, if we are to do our bit and to take the strain, I think we also need to have more limited objectives than the Prime Minister has set out. In self-defence, to support the peace process, but not just to create a vacuum for Assad to sweep into. It makes the imperative of avoiding civilian casualties even greater, because where there is any risk that people are being used as human shields to cover targets, however important those targets might be, those airstrikes should not go ahead. It makes the imperative of civilian protection even greater, and that's not mentioned in the government's motion. It should be the central objective, not just for humanitarian reasons to prevent the refugee crisis, but also to prevent the recruitment that fuels ISIS. And I think time limits too, because I don't support an open-ended commitment to airstrikes until Daesh are defeated, as I know the Foreign Secretary raised yesterday. Because if it isn't working in 6 months, or if it proves counterproductive, we should be ready to review, and we should also be ready to withdraw. And we will need to review this, and I think tonight we should lend the government support and keep that under review, not to give them an open-ended commitment that this should carry on, whatever the consequences might be. And I would say finally to the government, I have accepted their argument that if we want coalition airstrikes to continue on an international basis, we should be part of that. But I would also urge them to accept my argument that we should also do more to be part of supporting sanctuary for refugees who are fleeing that conflict too. And there are no easy answers in here. But I would say too, in the interests of cohesion in our politics and in our country, the way we conduct this debate is immensely important. None of us, however we vote tonight, are terrorist sympathisers, and none of us will have blood on our hands. The blood has been drawn by ISIS, Daesh, in Paris, across the world, and that is who we must stand against.
A 5-minute limit on backbench speeches will now apply. Nusrat Ghani.
Mr. Speaker, there has been a great deal of talk about our solidarity with our French allies following the horrific events in Paris. While it is all very well to metaphorically stand alongside our allies, we make a mockery of solidarity if we refuse to fly alongside them in skies over Syria. More than that, to make a mockery of our own credibility if we ignore UN Security Council Resolution 2249, which has been secured unanimously. Having called upon the world community to take action, and with the comprehensive and strategic argument the Prime Minister has put forward, we cannot ignore that call and expect our international partners to look at us with any shred of respect or goodwill. How can we ourselves have any self-respect when we leave this fight to the brave Kurdish women fighting with antiquated weapons? But this is not all about national pride, living up to our responsibilities or our own self-respect. It's about keeping the British people safe. Those at risk of being murdered by terrorists and those at risk of being brainwashed into joining them. And we are already doing that. I welcome the Prime Minister's announcement that £5 million will go towards the establishment of a new Commonwealth unit to counter extremism, and the announcement the Prime Minister made today of a comprehensive review to root out those funding extremists in the UK. According to Oxford University's Professor Scott Atran, 95% of Daesh recruits are signed up by friends and family. And there are few things more dangerous than misfits who feel they can live outside the law being recruited by the lure of Daesh. It's one of the most barbaric and strategically dangerous enemies we have ever faced. Its ability to recruit ordinary Westerners, its commitment to transforming them into murderers and suicide bombers, and its lack of mercy to any man, woman or child are unparalleled. It rapes, enslaves and decapitates. Its victims are Muslims, Kurds, Yazidis, Syrian, French and British. Acts of atrocity are how it sustains its image of invincibility, and its growth depends on a steady beat of battlefield victories looting along the way. It craves headlines which reinforce its apocalyptic propaganda, so much so that a manager of an electronic store in Raqqa said that Daesh loses popularity among ordinary, uneducated people when it loses its brilliant victories. And that, for me, is at the heart of this argument. The very destruction of the caliphate state in itself is the right thing, because its existence, along with its self-proclaimed caliph and the nonsense that they have fulfilled the Wahhabi ideology, Wahhabi prophecy, is the ideology.
Will my honourable friend give way? I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I'm enjoying listening to her develop her points. But does she agree with me that this motion tonight is not about military action alone in isolation? It's about a broader strategy.
Tonight's motion is not just about military intervention, it's about humanitarian and diplomatic relations as well. We must break the umbilical cord that acts as an anchor from Raqqa and offers a seduction of salvation and destruction to the already damaged minds of Westerners and Middle Easterners alike. Until we can demonstrate that we can scar and humiliate Daesh, we won't be taken seriously by those who are attracted to Daesh's bidding. Raqqa is its command and control. It's from there that it plans its trilogies of terror to control parts of Syria and Iraq and to establish wilayats or provinces which have already been declared in Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Nigeria, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Afghanistan and Pakistan, and closer to home to create command and control cells in Europe. Mr. Speaker, caliphates cannot exist as underground movements because they are founded upon territorial authority. So to destroy it and its pull, we must take away its command of territory. And to do that, we must take military action because Daesh cannot be negotiated with. They are not going to sit at a table and agree to a 10-point plan for a political settlement. So you have to take the fight to them. And I haven't met anyone opposed to airstrikes who's willing to go over and negotiate with them. There is nothing that we have that they want apart from our demise. They recently said, "We will conquer your Rome, break your crosses and enslave your women." As a Muslim woman, I will stand with people of all faiths who abhor Daesh's ideology, their rhetoric and their actions. We are justified in taking action to destroy them. They are a threat, and they won't rest until they have destroyed us and everything we stand for. And for that reason, Mr. Speaker, I will be voting in favour of the government's motion this evening.
Mr. Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a group of us on this side, Mr. Speaker, who are caught in between not opposed to any action, but of course also want to take action but feel the strategy isn't in place. We are making a decision today not based on airstrikes but an overall strategy. But let me say from the outset, I'm under no illusion that there is no perfect strategy given the particular complex circumstances of the civil war and insurgency in Syria. There is no certainty in the Middle East. We all want to protect our citizens and reduce the threat of Daesh, and a few more airstrikes, I'm afraid, will not do that. Some of it may not even be planned from Syria. We lack an overall strategy to confront ISIS, Daesh, who are established in other countries such as Libya. I'd like to make it clear that I'm not opposed again to military action, but I only support it if I believe there is a reasonable chance of success. I do not believe the argument that by bombing Daesh in Syria it will somehow greatly increase the chances of a terrorist attack in the UK. I think that's a wrong argument. Or that the government is proposing an indiscriminate bombing of Syrians. Again, a wrong argument. Also, I understand the argument about being restricted to Iraq, but I think clearly we were invited in there by an elected government and we have ground forces on the ground. We do not have that situation in Syria. In Syria, it's a much more uncertain situation, it's complex, and we do not have the ground forces that I believe we should have. The Prime Minister has also, I will give way.
John and I visited Iraq together last year, and the fact of the matter was the Iraqi army is totally destroyed. There were no ground forces in Iraq, leaving aside the Peshmerga, any more than there are now in Syria.
I don't think we can leave aside the Peshmerga, but also you may recall that actually the Sunnis need arming in Iraq, and the Prime Minister keeps agreeing to that.